Sheila, big show today. Elizabeth May from the Green Party is on.
What? No way.
Yeah, she'll be here in like 10 seconds.
I don't believe you, Scotty.
5 seconds.
I'm not sure about that.
Starting now. Welcome back. This is season 2 of Serious and Silly. Sheila, I'm very excited. We're all wearing green today, and there is a reason for that. Underneath, I could probably do this intro for about 45 minutes to an hour, but I'm going to try and keep it to about 2 minutes. When we think of most important people keeping our environment intact in Canada, you got to look no further than our guest today. She started out as an environmental lawyer before joining as the executive founding director of the Sierra Club, one of Canada's most important nonprofit environmental organizations. She's been the leader of the Green Party since 2006 and was elected as the first member of the Green Party as an MP in 2011. And just to brag a little bit more, Sheila, because we like to brag about our guests, she was Maclean's hardest working MP in 2013. She's been awarded the Officer to the Order of Canada and also the United Nations Global 500 Award for her work with the environment and so much more, but we really have to introduce her now. Miss Elizabeth May, welcome to Champlain College. Welcome to Serious and Silly.
Thank you. I have to add one thing. I didn't start as an environmental lawyer. I started doing environmental work in 1970 when I was in grade 10. So I never stopped. So for students at Champlain College, I'm really thrilled to have this time to chat with you. Wish it was in real life and that I was visiting you, but this is great. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of Wissahick Nation. It's the Indigenous territory that I'm honored to live in, and I'll speak to you in the language of the Indigenous people here, which is a language you've probably never heard of called Sanchothan. So, Haishka Siem. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh my goodness, I am blown away. Scott, you blew me away with that intro, but Elizabeth, you took it away with that honoring of the land. And wow, fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time. I mean, I said it so many times, but we really do appreciate you taking the time with us and our students. Speaking of Indigenous communities, we have our fantastic student ambassadors. We have our Indigenous student ambassadors. And when I had mentioned that we were going to be having you on the show, I asked them, is there a question that you would like to bring forth to Elizabeth, right? To get it right directly from your mouth from somebody that's working so hard to protect our world, to protect our planet. And they brought up a question. And if you wouldn't mind, I would like to ask it on their behalf.
Sure.
So their question is, Canada's water quality is known to be one of the best in the world. But why do so many First Nation communities suffer from water contamination and lack of access to safe, clean water?
Yes. Well, I think the answer is a term called environmental racism, which is a term that deals with the fact that if you look at where toxic dump sites are located, where pollution is tolerated, and this is true in the United States and Canada, you find more often than not communities, First Nations or Black and racialized communities. Now, in the case of the water for First Nations communities, for a lot of this water treatment apparatus is the responsibility of the federal government under federal bureaucracy. And what quite often happens is that a system is put in place that doesn't work exactly right, or that the maintenance isn't kept up. It's not locally owned and operated in the sense that First Nations are using Indigenous knowledge to access their own water supplies. You also have situations where quite often there's been an oil spill, or there's a contamination problem, or in the case of Grassy Narrows, several generations worth of mercury contamination. So it's a very scandalous reality for settler culture Canadians to recognize that this has been going on for so long. I know of hospitals in Mi'kmaq territory in New Brunswick where the hospital is under boil water advisories year after year after year. There are obviously technological solutions to water quality, and I will give credit to the current government. I know the minister responsible for Indigenous services is a Montreal area MP, so not too far from you. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that Mark Miller, I know, is doing his very best. He's got his heart and soul into it, but it's it's just decades and decades and decades of bad decision making, inadequate attention, and failure. And there's a long road ahead to remove all boil water advisories and ensure that Indigenous peoples have access to clean and safe drinking water, and that the tools to keep it clean and safe are in their own hands as a respect for sovereignty.
No, good, great points. You did touch upon oil contamination as a possibility. So it actually brings us to our next point. What are some of the effects or impacts of pipelines? I know it's a very hot topic of pipelines in general, but I guess you touched upon specifically with the Indigenous communities, but overall in general, what are some of the effects of pipelines?
Well, just to address the Indigenous question first, I mean, if we respect, which we should, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, then that requires free, prior, informed consent before any project takes place on our land. So before we even get into the question of what are the dangers, what are the rights of Indigenous peoples over their own territory, well, quite often what happens in Canada is the government says, well, we're going to build this pipeline. Now we'll consult First Nations. So that's obviously backwards. The UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, says prior, before a government stands up and says, we will build this pipeline, prior consent. So you can hardly say, well, now we've consulted with First Nations and we keep offering them money to accept the project that we've told them we're going to build, whether they like it or not. So do they accept it? Well, those are not, that's coercion. That's not consultation. So what are the risks? And there's some pipeline projects, and I did a recent TV thing with TVO that people can find online, where there was a pro-pipeline conservative MP who's a friend of mine and me explaining the differences. And of course, she asked a First Nations person who wants a pipeline built to talk about it. And I asked, if, in my territory down here with Sonic Nations, to talk about why they oppose it. It's really important to put that out there first, that free, prior, informed consent really matters. And you will find First Nations that have agreed to projects involving fossil fuel infrastructure. So the first thing that needs to be said, as the Assembly of First Nations told all the political parties in the last election, the number one issue is we're in a climate emergency, period. They said that's the number one issue of all issues we want to talk about. They didn't say this is the number one issue, environmental issue. The Assembly of First Nations was really clear. The number one issue is we are in a climate emergency and the government isn't acting like it. What does that climate emergency mean for all of us? Well, it means a real threat to whether we survive as a human family, a human civilization, to the end of this century. It's a real threat. It matters. So then you look at, why would we build any fossil fuel infrastructure? So before I talk about the specific environmental risks or risks to First Nations territories and rights, it's important to note that building something that's going to only make sense if it operates for 30 to 40 years from now, in a time when our government has said we've got to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And the scientists have said even more clearly, we have to cut at least in half what we emitted in 2010, at least cut that in half by 2030, to have good survival chances past 2030 to even get to 2050, right? So it's pretty insane. I would use the word, I don't know if it's a word that has come up at Champlain College classes yet, a phrase. It's worth thinking about this concept of cognitive dissonance. Like you're told one thing and you know it to be true, but do you act that way, right? So cognitive dissonance can be your dentist tells you to remember to floss and you know it, you know you should, but somehow you forget. So cognitive dissonance to me is that Justin Trudeau can say, and I also like Justin Trudeau, we're friends, but he can say, Canada is back, we believe in climate leadership, and we're building a pipeline. No, actually, those two things don't go together. Those two things are absolutely not only opposite, they're competitively opposite. If you do one, you don't get the other. So that's the case of pipelines. Then you have to back up. And I know this is a very much more complicated answer than you probably wanted, Sheila, but
no, it's okay.
Pipelines themselves, they're just an object. So the question of whether a pipeline is a good pipeline or a bad pipeline starts with what's in the pipeline. So imagine we were bringing fresh drinking water into a community and we used a pipe. That's not a problem, but the pipelines that are controversial, like Keystone, that the President of the United States just canceled, like Trans Mountain, that used to be called Kinder Morgan, which is the one that's going to go, that is a major threat to the communities and the biodiversity where I live here on southern Vancouver Island. And it's also an environment, it's all a climate threat. One more I'll mention because it affected Quebec, but it was canceled, was called Energy East. All three of those, Keystone, Energy East, and Kinder Morgan, now renamed Trans Mountain since the government of Canada bought it to build it at a cost of $17 billion. So that's a project we all own. Those three pipelines, what's in them? A solid fossil fuel precursor. It's not actually a fuel yet. It's a solid lump called bitumen. And it comes from the oil sands. That's where you mine bitumen. And when you get it out of the rock and the overburden and get rid of the muskeg in the forest, what you get is something solid, bitumen. So how do you put something solid in a pipeline to transport it? That's kind of hard. You dilute it. So you dilute it with fossil fuel condensate and things like, it's kind of like, for those of you who I don't know if you guys do any mechanics, but naphtha, think about that, sort of a light volatile fossil fuel product. They stir that into the bitumen and then they call it diluted bitumen. That's what goes in Trans Mountain, Keystone, Energy East. The purpose of diluting it is only to get it through the pipeline to a port somewhere or outside of Canada. In other words, it's a pipeline for export. And then it gets to another country. And then they take out the diluent, then they've got the solid lump. Then they need to upgrade the solid lump in order to get something called synthetic crude, which they can then put in a refinery. Now, the strange thing about this is everybody looks at pipelines versus trains. And because of Lac Mégantic and the disaster that happened there, the pro-pipeline people lied about this. And they said, look, pipelines are safer than trains. Well, okay, so back to my first question, what's in the pipeline? Even to answer the question about safety of fossil fuel products moving through a pipeline, it matters what kind of fossil fuel product it is. In the case of Lac Mégantic and that enormous tragedy, they had in that train something called Bakken shale, which means fracked oil from the US, from the shale deposits there. When you frack oil to create, and it's from these geological formation called the Bakken, B-A-K-K-A-N. So Bakken shale in the train at Lac Mégantic was full of other things that were explosive, very different kind. It absolutely should never be on a train, so it shouldn't be in a pipeline. Bakken shale is inherently really dangerous. If you put solid bitumen on a train and it crashed and rolled over, as I mentioned before, it's a solid lump. And it's also something you can't get to catch fire as hard as you might try. So people make big statements like, how can the Greens be against pipelines? Pipelines are safer than trains. Well, again, what's in the pipeline? If it's Bakken shale, not a good thing. If Bakken shale is on a train, that should be illegal. Bakken shale should never, ever, ever be transported by train ever again. We know that it blows up and creates a fireball and is super dangerous. Had that train been loaded with solid bitumen, nothing would have happened except for the physical reality of a train crashing. So what's the risk for us of dilbit in a pipeline? Well, so far as we know, you can't clean up dilbit. We've had no actual experience in the environment where dilbit could be cleaned up. The first time dilbit spilled was in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan, and they couldn't clean it up. The diluent separated from the bitumen sank to the river bottom. Now, okay, so that's a freshwater environment. So then the industry says, well, we've made lots of progress. We'd be able to clean it up in the ocean. Oh yeah? I don't think so. So the dilbit is inherently a dangerous product in a pipeline. The bitumen by itself could be shipped other ways, but backing up and saying, we don't want to be producing bitumen. As soon as we can, we should shut down that production because it produces a lot of greenhouse gases. But diluting it with diluent and putting it in a pipeline to then put it in tankers to ship out of the port of Burnaby, that's why the First Nations, the closer you get down to where my communities are, where I live, we're looking at, well, this would be the end of our southern resident killer whale population. They're already endangered. this would be, you'd never be able to clean this up. Don't tell me you can clean it up. You can't. The diluent will separate from the bitumen will sink. And that, by the way, I could get into all the details of different studies going one way and another on this, but there's a lot that the biggest level of risk you're going to get by shipping oil in a pipeline is if you're shipping diluted bitumen. The biggest risk you'll ever get shipping oil on a train is if you're shipping Bakken shale. So you always have to back up and ask, what's being shipped? What are the impacts for climate? What are the immediate impacts for water quality? What are the impacts on Indigenous rights if the Indigenous nations that are involved in this don't want them? And I'll just back up. One last pipeline story is Energy East, because the propaganda for Energy East was amazing. What they said there, you may have remembered even hearing it. Oh, we're just going to bring Alberta oil to refineries in Eastern Canada, and that'll be great. None of the refineries in Eastern Canada can process bitumen. None of them. So they were bringing them, the plan for Energy East was to bring them to the Port of St. John, New Brunswick, to ship it out in tankers. So not about what they said it was about. The project was canceled. I'm glad it was canceled. I'm really glad Keystone just got canceled. And I hope that the government of Canada comes to its senses and decides not to spend our money, $17 billion, to build a pipeline that doesn't have a business case. That's why Kinder Morgan left Canada. This is a loser economically. And our politicians, Bill Morneau and Justin Trudeau, decided that it would be more embarrassing for Kinder Morgan to leave, saying it's really hard to build a pipeline in Canada. Well, good, go back to Texas. But they went back to Texas with $4.4 billion of our money for the first part of the pipeline that nobody minded. It's been there forever. And then to spend another $13 billion to build a second pipeline along a similar route. So it's pipelines are, for me, I mean, I'm very committed to stopping the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I got arrested to fighting against the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I can't believe that our government has bought it and insisting on building it over the objections of most of the First Nations that have, I mean, and hanging on and objecting is so hard. My friends in the nations here on southern Vancouver Island, Coast Salish nations, are saying, you know, at the point that the government keeps saying we're building it, and wouldn't you like some money? We're building it anyway. Don't you want to agree and say you'd like some money? To hang tough on that when you're a poor community, to say no, no, our fisheries, our salmon, our way of life depends on this not being built. That's such courage.
Yeah, I totally, yes. This issue is so complex. I mean, we would just be speaking for about 7 minutes on this, and I have so many questions, and so it's so complex. And the way that you kind of mentioned it, it's just I think people need to do the research regarding, it's not just, you know, a pipeline, it's everything that encompasses it. It's the people that are involved in it, the communities, what's in it, it's everything, our government, everything. So thank you for taking the time with us to just kind of explain on.
Well, you know, it's frustrating, Sheila, because it did take 7 minutes for sure.
No,
but
you
think about, but the CBC National News, do they ever explain the difference between Bakken shale in a train and bitumen in a pipeline or on a train? This is part of our problem, is also media literacy around climate issues and around environmental issues in general. And I'm grateful for the chance to explain, to get it into your serious and silly broadcast, because the more people who understand it, the better. It's not as advertised.
Exactly, and bringing it to our youth, I think that's probably one of the strongest tools that we have, really, to change what's going on in the world. It took serious and silly to bring a message.
We're going to save the pipeline. Yes. Well, thank you, Miss May. Yes, just such an informative answer, and really, like you said, you know, you can't take people at their word. There's just so much more to it than meets the eye. So thank you for informing us. I just want to say it's such a pleasure listening to you speak, you know, because, you know, it comes with such genuineness, you know, your care for the environment and your care for Canadians. And I think it's just a reminder of why the Green Party is such an important part of our political landscape, and keeping our our politicians honest. So,
And you know what's fun? I just want to say, Scott, most of the people I work with in Ottawa, I've mentioned this a couple times, how much I like Mark Miller, how much I like Justin Trudeau, how we're friends, right? So it's hard because politics looks like everybody's fighting all the time. These are genuinely good people who mean well. But why do they do bad things? Well, I think a lot of it is because it's hard for them to get deeply into the details. They count on other people advising them. And the whole structure of government for a very long time is pro-fossil fuels. Our departments within the government, and not just because of any one politician like a Stephen Harper, but the residual influence of having provided advice for the way the political winds are blowing keeps influencing things even after those political winds shift. So where do you need what you need to have good political leadership from your prime minister or your MP is really, really a lot of public pressure all the time that says, you know what? That wasn't a good answer. Try again. We don't think that was a good answer. And so the public pressure, the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful work of Fridays for the Future of the student groups around the world. You know, I think the global leader on climate action isn't anybody in politics. It's Greta Thunberg, who started her school strike by herself a couple of years ago, just by herself, sitting in front of her school in Stockholm on Fridays and saying, I'm not going to school on Fridays anymore. Not in a million years would anyone who put that forward as a proposition. The world will change. People's attitudes on climate will change because a 15-year-old schoolgirl in Sweden is going to stop going to school on Fridays with a little sign she made at home. Not so likely. But again, if for any of the students at Champlain College who went into Montreal and walked September last year, I was walking in Montreal last year, we had over 1 million people across Canada walking on the same day, but it was a very, very much a youth-led movement. And it's very, very important for Justin Trudeau to feel the pressure of that youth-led movement. It's important for Jonathan Wilkinson, who's now the Minister of Environment, to feel that pressure, because if they take the easy answers, they're not so easy sometimes. They think they're making a hard decision. They still haven't grasped the climate emergency. They still don't act like it's an emergency. But as I said, they're not bad people. They have to be pressured.
Awesome. So Ms. May, we're going to switch gears and we're going to ask you not only to use your knowledge here, but to use your crystal ball. And me and Sheila, we like to keep it a little silly. So it's time to play, Sheila, the secret game.
The secret game.
So the secret game, Miss May, is a little bit of a play on your name. We're going to play maybe or maybe not. So we're going to give you a little bit of like some environmental things, and we would like you to think of whether they're going to happen, say, in the next 20, 30 years. If you think they are, give us a maybe. If you think they're not, give us a maybe not.
Okay.
So Sheila will start us off.
Okay. So the end of the dependence on oil.
Maybe, but I have to say, absolutely, that's going to happen.
Nice. Okay, so maybe, so absolutely, actually. Thank you.
One of our great problems is plastic, and especially plastic water bottles. So the banning of plastic water bottles in Canada.
Maybe.
Nice. 2 for 2. This is good, guys. All right. Next one. Clean water for all.
Maybe.
Nice.
And then you mentioned this briefly in your thing, a net zero carbon footprint for Canada and Canadian companies.
Maybe. But I'll just say, I know you probably don't want me to keep jumping in on the snappers, but it's a tricky one because the government's pledged net zero, which means there'd still be some emissions, but they'd be offset somewhere else. So it's a netting out.
Okay.
So net zero as opposed to real zero by 2050 to make sure our global average temperature doesn't go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. But again, I mentioned this in the very beginning and I want to emphasize it. To hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to do way, way more in the next 5 to 8 years. So it's not like a steady line. If we start in 2020 and we've got till 2050, we go like that. No, if we don't do basically now, we don't get there. So but we'll get there.
Okay.
It's amazing that we were 4 for 4, because a lot of environmental issues, you hear the doom and gloom. So to hear some positivity that's coming out is wonderful. And then we just have one more, maybe or maybe not. When COVID is over and Miss May, you're in the Montreal area, maybe or maybe not, you might drop by Champlain College and say hi to us and our students.
Maybe, maybe, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to.
We would love having you. We would absolutely love having you.
We like to put people on the spot, and we also like to use this as a contractual contract, verbal contract that you said you would come by and visit.
I would love to, for sure. Yeah. And I think, looking at COVID and just telling everyone to be careful, those variants mean that the things that we thought we knew how to do the last year, goodness knows, who would have believed we'd be still talking about this, but the wash your hands, don't touch your face, wear your mask, stay 6 feet apart. Those worked for COVID-19 that we knew. We're now getting a different COVID-19 with variants. Those things may not work. So we sure can't take chances on anything less than stay 6 feet apart, wear your mask, wash your hands. We may need to wear 2 layers of masks, but listen carefully to the public health advice. Be very careful to protect your parents and your grandparents by keeping yourselves safe, because right now we are not safe, and we may be less safe here in 2021 than we were in 2020 before we had variants from Brazil and variants from South Africa and a variant from the UK. Viruses, this is a great time to learn your science. Viruses mutate. This is not a big surprise. And right now, the human family, it's a very interesting, exciting time. If you think like a scientist, we're one big petri dish experimenting with parasitic viruses. Not fun to sit in a big petri dish, but be careful. Honestly, even if you're, don't gather in groups at all. Stay safe, protect your parents and your grandparents. It's the worst thing ever for kids. I think it's horrible to not be able to get out and be with friends. I got grandkids. I know how tough this is on them. But if we can hang on another 2 months of being super careful, we should know where we are. The parents and the grandparents will be vaccinated. Things will get better. They should be way better by summer, but they're not better now. So be super, super careful.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth May, for that. We have one more question, and it's mainly just to ask you, because I guess we're always like wondering, okay, well, there's all these issues, we feel overwhelmed, but what can we do as a society, as students, as citizens of this planet, in regards to taking care of our environment and taking care of this climate change issue?
Yeah. Well, the number one thing is to do something. Now, this was how I was raised, so I'll just share it with you. This is what my grandmother was the phrase she gave my mother, and this is what my mother always said to me for things like when I'd come home from school and say, I've got too much homework, I can't get it all done this weekend, I get feeling overwhelmed, I can't clean my room and do my homework. And so this was the phrase: thought without constructive action is demoralizing. So take any constructive action and you'll feel better about it. So in the case of climate action, in COVID, in lockdown, start trying to figure out getting yourself published in a letter to the editor, to the local paper or the Montreal Gazette or any paper across the country. Think about how can you convey how you feel about any issue, maybe animal rights. Maybe it's the what's going on right now in India with the farmers, whatever it is. See if you can write a letter that's 250 words long, because that's what newspapers want, that actually says what you want to say, and send it in and get it published. And you'll find yourself feeling, more empowered, because you're actually influencing people who read the newspaper, including the politicians who read the newspaper. You can also write letters directly to politicians. This is a good activist activity that you can do from home during COVID, and it's a life skill that will, I promise you, I started writing letters to the editor when I was, I don't know what, in grade 5. And it's one of those things that that will serve you for your whole life. You'll be an effective citizen between elections and even before you're old enough to vote by learning how to write exactly what you want to say in as few words as you can get into a letter to the editor. And it's sometimes it's easier to write a long rant. It's easier. It's hard work to break it down and say, okay, I've counted it up. I've got 250 words. I've now said exactly what I need to say. And use social media the same way. Put things out that you see that are important on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram. All those different platforms. They can be kind of scummy sometimes, but if you're putting out positive messages and sharing solid information, you're also making a difference.
So speaking of social media, if we do have our students that would like to follow your amazing messages that you have, how would they do that? Would it be? Well,
my Twitter feed is pretty easy. I think my name is just @ElizabethMay on Twitter. And I put things out there quite often. I share articles that I've seen, and last night I put one out on the science around why so much of Canada right now is super, super cold because of the polar vortex, but the Arctic is super warm. How did that happen? And I kept looking online till I found a good article from a scientific journal, and I put it out there so that people could have a look and understand the science. So that's one way. And then of course I have a member of Parliament website that doesn't have anything to do with the Green Party. So it's Elizabeth May MP, all one word, elizabethmaymp.ca. And that website, we put up the articles I write and debates in Parliament and that kind of thing. And if you're on that, there's no partisanship in that. There's nothing about the Green Party or any party. It's just about the work I'm doing. So in some ways it might be a little bit boring. I don't know, but those would be two ways to see. I'm just looking back to see whether anybody liked the article I posted last night. It was kind of late by the time because 3 hours later in BC, by the time I put some things up, it's after midnight in Montreal. But
it's okay, Elizabeth. So, after we post this, you're going to get all kinds of likes from our shoot.
I got so far on that one. I got 96 likes.
There you go.
So that's something. But when you hit it big time, you get thousands of likes. But it's important. I try to share stuff that's actually information. Yeah. So
thank you so much, Elizabeth May, for joining us today. I'm going to put your social media handles in the description after. If you guys want to keep following our Serious and Silly, you can follow us on Tuesdays. We post on our Champlain Saint-Lambert YouTube page. And Scott, would you like to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Miss May. As you said, you wrote your first letter when you were 10 years old. Our students are 17 to 20, so you have some catching up to do, but yeah, it's never too early to start caring about your planet. And thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule.
Well, thank you, because as I said, the leadership on this issue is coming from exactly the age group at Champlain. This is where we're all looking to you for. I'm not going to leave it for you to have to do, by the way. Young people should not feel that people my age are going to just say, oh, well, you can handle it. No, you don't let the old people off the hook. We cause the problem. It's up to us to fix it. So your job is to make sure that people my age never get a moment's rest until they fix it.
I love it. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much.
Amazing.
Great to meet with you. We'll see you in person one of these days.
Oh, yes, for sure. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.